Hello, everybody. Welcome to Warlocks and Waffles. It is a beautiful, what is it, Monday? It is a beautiful Monday morning. We are here with the fantastic Doctors Kilmer from Game to Grow. We're very excited. Why don't you guys go ahead and just introduce yourselves, and then we'll dive in here.
Sure. I can go first. So my name is Dr. Elizabeth Kilmer. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist located in the state of Washington, and I am the Director of Education and Training for Game to Grow. Do you want me to go ahead and introduce Game to Grow?
Sure, absolutely.
So, Game to Grow is a 501c3 nonprofit organization located in Seattle, Washington, but we serve people all over the world. We are most well known for our social flourishing or therapeutic social skills groups that utilize games like tabletop role playing games like Dungeons and Dragons and Minecraft. We also offer individual counseling services, and we have a training program for mental health professionals, educators, and community members to teach them how to use applied games in their settings.
Awesome.
And I'm Dr. Jared Kilmer. I'm also a clinical psychologist in the state of Washington. At Game to Grow, I serve as the Director of Counseling Services.
Awesome. I'm just excited to have you guys on. I think I first learned about Game to Grow. Was it last year? It might have been last year. But I had sort of heard about you guys, but I hadn't really delved into anything like that. And then we do some stuff with 1985 games, and so Justice from 1985 sent us over some stuff about like, hey, we're going to be doing a thing with them. So here's more information about them. So we started showing off the one of the videos during one of our streams, and people were like, "That's super cool. We want more information." So here we are. I will apologize right off the bat if my audio goes out. It's because I am still a little bit sick from Gen Con, and so my cough will kick up, and it sounds horrible. So I will save you all from that. Let's see here. Just to get started, when you guys both interact with TTRPGs and stuff like that in the Game to Grow space, when did you guys first get into TTRPGs?
I think my answer is actually kind of late compared to a lot of my peers. It would be about 2015, right as around Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition was coming out. It was something that I had always thought I'd be interested in, but kind of avoided growing up. And then when it kind of hit a reset, I was like, oh, this is the time. So that's when I got into the TTRPG space. And within about a year of like entering that world, I started making connections that this could be relevant to some of the insights I was seeing in myself and some of my like mental health patients, and started wanting to apply that
Okay.
to mental health. I think I'm answering two questions at once. Elizabeth, what about you?
Yeah, so Jared got me into tabletop RPGs. We met in grad school and started playing with friends because in grad school somehow we found like 6 hours basically every Sunday to get together and play, which was great. And then we saw the Adam and Adam of Game to Grow. Then it was Wheelhouse Workshop. Jared saw them in a PAX South and was like, wow, this like really fits in with a lot of the work we're doing with trauma and substance abuse. And they Adam and Adam were primarily working with adolescents and focusing on social skills. And we were like, we think we could do this in our populations. And so kind of pulled our knowledge of tabletop RPGs as well as really pulled on some of the modalities that we were working with in grad school. So acceptance and commitment therapy, cognitive behavioral therapies, like cognitive processing therapy, and got some groups started.
That's awesome. I will apologize to the chat because apparently Streamlabs thought that I was using a different mic than I was using. So when I muted this mic, it didn't mute for anyone who was in the chat, which is unfortunate. I don't know. I don't know if it came through on your guys' end or if I muted for you guys, but I apologize if you heard it. Okay. One of. Oh, what is going on? Give me 1 second. Everything is broken. There we go. Now we're back. I don't know. I don't know what's going on. Okay. Somebody in the chat wanted to know, when did the psychology community learn about the therapeutic values of TTRPGs?
Ooh, that is a great question. And there's a really fuzzy answer on that. So the answer is we're working on it, and also the 80s. So there are some kind of early case studies as early as the 80s of therapists or psychiatrists or psychologists working with individuals and using tabletop role-playing games as a way to build rapport or build insight.
Mm-hmm.
In the 80s, there was the satanic panic,
Mm-hmm.
which, in the US was a moral panic. We had similar moral panics over video games and rock and roll music. But there was a lot of kind of sensationalized media around the problems with tabletop role-playing games. Now, if you go back and you look at some of that sensationalized media and you actually know anything about a tabletop role-playing game, it's pretty clear to see that, like, oh, no one's actually worshiping the devil. This isn't necessarily promoting antisocial activities. Like, you actually have to play with other humans. It's a collaborative game, but there was a lot of fear and concern. And so that really kind of pushed down some of the potential research around that. So we've seen a really big resurgence of that in the last 15 years, especially the last 5 or 10. There recently were 2 kind of general reviews of the literature that have come out that said, hey, this could absolutely be helpful. And this is still an area of emerging research. So we need more.
And I think where you define like the psychology community broadly can determine the answer, because with Elizabeth's answer, like, some people were engaging in it in the 80s, and that's probably less than 1% of like mental health providers. It's becoming more common today, and I still think we are like a pretty relatively unknown area of mental health. The majority of providers don't engage in this kind of work, and I would also assume don't know that it exists yet.
Sure.
Those that do know of it may be skeptical because they don't fully understand it, and then a smaller subset understands what it is, can see its application, and is actually doing it. So I might argue that the broader community isn't really aware yet, and it's still in its infancy.
I don't want to get too deep into the research in case no one else cares. But I will
If it's something
say,
you guys care about,
we
want to
about
hear
it
all
a
about
lot.
it.
I am deeply steeped in the research. So one of the things that I think is really interesting, so if you're familiar with other modalities, for example, cognitive processing therapy is a cognitive behavioral treatment for PTSD. And it was originally developed for use with typically like women survivors of sexual assault.
Mm-hmm.
And that was like where the initial research was, and it was initially studied, and then it was used with veterans and military combat, and it's been like it's kind of broadened out. But there was really initially this kind of target population, and so we could study, how does this work with this target population? And one of the challenges we want to run into research with humans, and this is why we see in a lot of randomized controlled trials, or like which are kind of considered some of the gold standard in some research circles, is this idea that to test something, I'm going to take someone who's just depressed. There's nothing else interesting about that person other than they are depressed. They don't have like major social issues. They don't have big things going on in their life other than that depression. I'm going to see if this treatment works. If it works, awesome. This works on depression. The reality is most people are messier and more interesting than a person who is depressed.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
I mean, I was treated for depression for a couple of years before I was like, hey, could this be like a symptom of something else? And they were like, oh, maybe. And then I found out I had really bad untreated ADHD.
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So we find that like in the real world, we don't see that. And oftentimes some modalities will come from more of that research space where we're focusing on kind of an individual. And obviously, cognitive processing therapy has really wide-ranging impacts for people who've experienced trauma, lots of different types of trauma, lots of different ages. There's even kind of a version of it that works with kids, which is awesome. But it started really small and it started with a really specific population. Tabletop RPGs in applied settings, so therapeutically applied RPGs, people are already seeing like, oh, we could do this with adults and we could do this with kids. I mentioned, so Jared and I have done this work with adolescents with trauma. We've done this work with veterans of multiple ages with histories of trauma and substance abuse and depression. We work with adolescents who have anxiety disorders and depressive disorders and are neurodivergent. So there's a lot, there's a really kind of wide ranging population. So when we look at the research, we've got like one study over here that looks at autistic youth in Japan. We have another study over here that looks at neurodivergent youth who are considered gifted in terms of IQ level. We've got another study that looks at adults who are experiencing depressive or anxiety disorders. And when we're thinking about really talking about how solid is this research, we want to see multiple studies with the same kinds of populations, looking at the same kinds of things. And so we have really broad research in some areas of tabletop RPGs in the applied settings, but we don't have that kind of history of here are 12 studies with adolescents with an autism diagnosis and what tabletop RPGs look like.
No, that makes a lot of sense. BBG Hayward in the chat says, "Isn't Let's Talk to the Teddy Bear technically an instance of role play in therapy?"
Well, there's tons of research about role play in therapy.
It's just a difference for
role play is so broad. And I will say, so we have a training program, and our training program, we're accredited by the American Psychological Association to be able to offer CEs for psychologists. And they don't let you do that unless you're able to cite some sources.
Right.
And so and that's also something that's really important to us. And so our modality has a ton of theoretical support. So we're pulling from the vast amount of literature there is on the use of role play in therapy, because that happens in cognitive behavioral therapies, it happens in Gestalt, it happens all over the place. We're also pulling from the vast amount of research in simulation training, because we use simulation training in flight and in medicine and in military applications and in education. And there's tons of research that talks about what makes simulation training effective, where people are able to learn, how kind of aroused in terms of like asleep versus distressed someone needs to be to retain information. So there's a ton of literature that supports the use of tabletop RPGs in therapeutic applications, but there aren't as many studies that look at the specific modality or the specific use.
Sure. That's super cool. So you guys originally you were just doing games in person, right? With Game to Grow, but over the pandemic you've started doing them online as well?
Yes, we just started a couple. We have a couple of groups that are in person now with some COVID precautions. But the majority of our groups, we see about 150 participants a week.
That's awesome.
And the majority of those groups are all online.
That's very, very cool. And what's the average age of people participating with Game to Grow?
That is a great question. I'm going to give you my best remembering guess. So we see participants ages online is a little bit harder for younger participants. So with the pandemic, we've seen more like 8 and up. 10 is really a pretty ideal starting point. And then we see adults as well. And so I would say our average age is probably in that 12 to 15 range.
Awesome.
I would agree with that. Yeah.
Yeah, I used to work at a boarding school for troubled and at-risk youth as a house parent, and so one of the things that I always did with the boys that lived in my house was I would play D&D with them, and I worked with 13 to 18-year-olds, and so you could like the amount of like stuff that they would just work out on their own from playing through D&D was always so cool to watch, where I would have like they would have to meet with their therapist or whatever once a week, and having them text me and being like, "Hey, so can you tell me who like insert random NPC is?" Because they're talking about them as if they're an old friend, and I've never heard of them before. And just it's so cool to see that, like, all the emotional and like deep stuff that you can get into in a game that you just don't really think about because it's a game.
Yeah, but you're tapping into something really cool and special where a lot of this game takes place in our imaginations. We're sitting around the table, but when you ask me to remember something that occurred in a game, whether that was in person or online, a lot of my memories play out more like a movie where I was in that scene than just hearing about it or observing it.
Absolutely. I mean, I look back on, I started playing D&D in high school, towards the beginning of high school. And looking back, I can definitely remember key moments from the campaigns we were playing in high school better than I remember like actual high school. Like, I don't remember a whole lot about algebra, but I remember the entire story of Zaitarian. Like, it's cool to see how those stories sort of cement themselves with you. Crimson Rockstar in the chat wants to know, are there any specific modules that you have found helpful in helping others out? Are there specific ones that work well or better?
Yes and no.
Okay.
And I can talk a little bit more about this. This is the place where I remind everyone, don't do therapy on your friends. Not that anyone in this chat would do that, but don't do therapy on your friends. And obviously none of the information we're giving today is specific medical advice.
Sure.
None of us are your therapist. But I can talk about this question because it's a great question. So in terms of, if we're talking about using this in therapeutic applications, you can absolutely use homebrew. You can absolutely, like, I don't know if y'all can see all of the D&D books on behind Jared's face right now. So Jared you do a fair amount more homebrew now, but you used to do almost all modules that you would adapt to be appropriate for your groups and what their goals were. I don't do modules well. The very first group the very first game I ever ran was to my parents, because I needed people who would still like me after I did a terrible job. And I did a bad job. And I was running a module, and I really struggled. I got in my head about trying to do it right and needing to know what was on the page. And that just didn't work for me. And so doing homebrew is something that works much, much better. And I never consider myself a super creative person, but somehow when I can pull in all of the stories from all of the books that I read, because I didn't have friends when I was in middle school and I read books instead, I get to pull all that and I can make some cool stories with my players. And so no matter kind of where you're starting, if we're in a kind of a therapeutic context, we're going to tailor the stories, we're going to tailor the encounters to fit our players. Sure. Now, that being said, there's this amazing, it's actually, you can see it behind my head, maybe. It's the black box above the Stardew Valley board game. But it's Critical Core, which was developed by Game to Grow. It is kind of a starter kit for therapists and educators and parents who want to leverage the power of games and tabletop RPGs with their participants. Now, you can absolutely use Critical Core in therapy, but it's not inherently therapy, right? Like, it's not going to turn you into a therapist. You could still play Critical Core with your friends, with your family members, without doing therapy on them. But it is your classic tabletop RPG. If you're familiar with games like Dungeons and Dragons, it's going to look very similar.
Sure.
And it comes with pre-made characters. The way the modules are laid out are really great for new GMs or GMs who struggle with running modules like me, because everything you need is kind of on that page. And it's enough that you have like kind of a script to just start the encounter. But beyond that, it's kind of just like, here's some information you may need to run it. And those modules specifically for Critical Core were really designed to help support social flourishing in game. So they were really designed to help support collaboration and perspective taking and planning and pretend play. And all of those pieces are in the module, and the encounters themselves will actually say like, hey, this encounter is going to help support regulation, or this encounter is going to help support perspective taking.
That's really cool.
So
And
to
if
circle
you,
back to the
yeah,
original question, I think there's not a lot of modules written with like therapeutic application in
Sure.
mind. And many times if you're going to use a module for that purpose, you need to be mindful and intentional about like how and why and what might need to be adjusted. But if any modules are being written to scaffold a therapist to do that job well, Critical Core was like designed for that and not just something you can rig to accomplish that goal.
yes.
Yeah.
I actually want to call out one other module. So Take This developed a module, Gardens of Fog, which is a really well-written module. It's really well written. It's beautiful. It really does a lot of like personifying different things, like personifying depression. It's also a great example of a module that can hit much harder emotionally than you necessarily intend it to. And so Gardens
Sure.
of Fog is one where I'm like, you should go look at it. And also, maybe don't run it depending on your group, right? Like if you have a bunch of people who are feeling like pretty stable and good and like they have all of their stuff kind of ironed out and they're like, yeah, I want to like think about it, what it was like to feel depressed or sad. Cool. I will say like as a therapist who and it was generally pretty stable and happy. I was a player in Gardens of Fog and I hadn't read the module ahead of time on a stream, and it was really emotionally impactful. It was a little bit more emotionally impactful than I necessarily like wanted to feel on a
Right.
streamed game.
Yeah, on
Now
a stream, that's rough.
I was playing with other people that I absolutely trusted. I was playing with a couple other therapists. I had worked with a GM several times before and really loved and trusted them. We had great safety tools in place. But every once in a while, right, you'll find those modules where you're like, oh, this is hitting harder than I thought. And I think Gardens of Fog is one in which it's amazing and I'm so glad it exists. And I always want to caution people around like, that's one where it feels like if you like were thinking about doing therapy on your friends, you lean towards that module. And I would say, please don't, because that's a space where like you open up a box, but you don't know how to
Right.
put it back to
You don't know how to get everything back in it once it's out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But you should go read it. It's a beautiful module.
That's awesome. Yeah, I will. Let me make a note of that because I will immediately forget. Okay. In the chat we're seeing TTRPGs have made people feel less introverted and more able to be social. I know I've definitely found that with some of my very, very introverted friends who start playing a character who's not introverted, and before long, like they're in that character. That's always so much fun to see, like as they slowly just become the character at the table. And then helps them sort of like learn how to do that with that group. They know what they like. They get better at coming out of their shell a little bit, which is awesome to see. Davy Jones says it's also helped him with social confidence a lot, which is very, very good. I just got to meet Davy Jones for the first time at Gen Con. Davy Jones has been, I have run games for him for over a year now, and has been in our chat like every stream we've ever had, and then also is now in our actual play, and finally got to meet him for the first time at Gen Con, and it was a delight. I miss you already. You mentioned safety tools. I would love to circle back to that because I know that's sort of I don't want to call it a hot button issue, but like I'm a professional GM. That's what I do, and I hear GMs constantly who are like, I don't want to use a safety tool. Like I don't want to do that. And I always tell them, like, I'm like, a safety tool is not there to make your game worse. It's not there to force you to do things a specific way. It's there to make sure everybody's having a good time. So would you be willing to talk on safety tools a little bit?
Yeah. So when people are like, oh man, I don't want to use that, that like slows down my game or makes my game less interesting. My response is usually a nicer version of, oh, you're just using safety tools wrong.
Right.
Like you just don't know how to use them. Because in a lot of ways, like using safety tools actually streamlines your game because you're not necessarily needing to like try and figure out if someone is like play upset, right? Like they are embodying their character who is really scared or really offended or really uncomfortable. Like you're able to check in without having to be a mind reader.
Right.
You also are able to have more of an understanding. And safety tools are really broad, right? If we think about like, what are the safety features in your car? There's the automatic ones that we think about like, oh, your seatbelt is a safety feature or your airbags are a safety feature. But there's actually like the way that the hood of your car crumples is also a safety feature. So we've got the ones that are like big and flashy and everybody knows about it. And then we have the ones that are working in the background. So one of the kind of easiest ways to get started with safety tools is having some kind of consent checklist that you start out with before you get started, right? Monty Cook has a consent checklist. There's lots of them.
I love the Monty Cook one.
The Monty Cook one is great, right? If you're running games with kids, maybe take out some of the ones. Like when I'm running games with kids, I don't necessarily like there's stuff that is absolutely not going to be in the game because it would be wildly inappropriate for 12-year-olds.
There's some stuff that doesn't even need to be on the safety checklist.
I don't want to accidentally teach 12-year-olds to go Google something. Right. So we like won't put those on our checklist, but we always have like a no list and a please list. And sometimes that's scaffolded by a checklist. Those checklists can be really helpful. I always say when introducing a checklist like the Monty Cooks, like there are plenty of things on Monty Cooks where I'm like that, I'm not going to put some of these things in my game. That wouldn't be fun for me. So sometimes as a GM, I'll actually go ahead and cross those things off and say, hey, just so y'all know, like I'm not comfortable with this stuff coming up in the game. It's not, right? Or this wouldn't be appropriate for stream, even if it would be okay in a home game. So we're not going to put that on there. So some of this is just like, what's the kind of game we want to play? What is this going to look like for us? Typically when I do no lists and please lists, I will take everybody's no list, and I need to know what's on your no list because sometimes I might have follow-up questions. For example,
and a no list and a please list would be similar to like lines and veils or stars and wishes sort of thing.
Yes, similar. So no list is like if these things are in the game, they're gonna make me not want to play this game anymore. They're gonna make me not feel comfortable, not feel safe. They're just gonna make me feel burned out, and I don't want to deal with it. You don't have to justify why you want something on the no list.
Right.
But as a GM, I might occasionally need to ask follow-up questions. For example, if you say like, hey, I really don't want sexism in this game. I might say, do you just not want sexism to exist? Do you not want sexism directed at you? Do you want sexism to exist, but you have the power to like change it?
Sure.
And the answer may be, I just don't want sexism in the game at all. Cool, done. We can handle that. But maybe you're like, oh yeah, I want to be able to like change someone's ideas, or I want to be able to shift systems because I can't do that as easily in the real world. So it'd be cool to have it done here.
Yeah, it's like I've had people sign up for games of mine where they're like, I want no racism in the game. And it's like, great. That's totally fine. Are you okay with there being racism if those people are clearly the bad guys? Like,
and the answer may be no.
Right, and if they say no, absolutely fine. We change that up. We go forward in a different direction. But yeah, if there's checks and balances in place.
Absolutely.
I usually tell GMs when they're new to safety tools that I always like to have a preliminary or a preemptive safety tool and an ongoing safety tool. Something that like we're going to go over before the game has ever started, and then something that gives a voice to players during the game if they need it. I use a red light, green light card on my table, so they just adjust the color of a card at any time if they need to.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Yeah. So the no list, please list, right? The no is like, I do not want these things in my game. The please list is part of the way that tabletop RPGs are collaborative, right? The GM is not just this omnipotent God who decides everything that happens in the game. The player's action should have consequences, like they should have an impact on the game. And so the please list, or these are the things that I would like to see in the game. The reason we call it a please list instead of a yes list is it's not a guarantee, right? Like you might want there to be cool things in the game. And obviously if it's like, man, I would really like there to be other queer characters in the game. Yeah, sure. I'm going to bend over backwards to make sure there are other queer characters in the game, 100%.
Yeah.
But the please list is like, what are the things that you're excited about? And so getting to kind of do both of those at once can be this really nice way where we're thinking about how do we keep us safe? How do we keep us engaged versus nothing else? For GMs who are like, oh man, I don't want safety tools, like they bog down the game. Nothing bogs down your game more than like accidentally stumbling upon somebody else's trauma and then having to deal with that.
Yeah.
Because they probably didn't want that, and you definitely don't want that, and no one at that table may be equipped to handle that in the moment. And so the other piece is, like you mentioned, talking about the in-game piece. Mm-hmm. And the in-game piece is, I think, actually more challenging for a lot of people than doing a good consent checklist.
Sure.
Because you not only need to have an in-game like a red light or a green light. I'm sure you do this. Mm-hmm. You need to talk about what happens when the red light goes on. Right. Does that mean we just pretend that thing didn't happen? Because that might actually be incredibly invalidating to someone. Yeah. If we accidentally stumbled on something that made me really upset, I might want it to not have happened in the game, but I also want the players around the table to understand that like I may need a couple of minutes to re-regulate. Right. And get back to a place in which I feel comfortable and safe.
I've sat at a table where somebody like set off the like I don't like what's happening right now, and the GM was like, oh, okay, cool, and then just rewound time a couple of minutes and then just immediately started back up again, and the player was very clearly not okay to start back up again. Yeah, it's important those.
And so just checking in ahead of time, right? Mm-hmm. About like. One of the things the GM can do can be like, okay, cool. Would you like us to rewind time and start that over? Would you like us to like basically fade to black and then come back in? And so the player or the characters get a chance to kind of process what happened. How do we want to handle this? And then having that be just like very simple, very straightforward, and very easy gives that player a lot more autonomy over the thing that was really upsetting. And so thinking about it that way, that's going to help you move your game forward. It's going to make sure that everybody's safe. Because if you just move that game forward, you might feel okay, but that's not going to create an atmosphere at your table where your players are going to be creative and engaged. They're not going to trust you as much. So if you do safety tools right, they make your game easier and more streamlined. And you honestly spend less time talking about stuff that makes people uncomfortable.
Yeah, absolutely. You could couch this under like morals and ethics and accommodations, and I would agree with that. But if that doesn't resonate with you as an issue of pragmatism, do you like stepping on landmines and having your game disrupted like Elizabeth described? Probably not. And what are your goals as a game master? Maybe it's just to tell a story and you don't really care how it impacts people, in which case maybe you're wasting your time with safety tools. But if you are trying to tell a story that you are sharing with other people, and like your criteria for success is everybody went home thinking, oh, that was awesome, I want to come back, then it would behoove you to try to gain some insight into the things that might be triggering or extra rewarding to your players. And it could take very low effort to get a lot of good data.
Yeah, that's very good. I like the mental image of the landmine, because that is literally what it is. If you've stepped into something that you shouldn't have stepped into, like that's not good, and it's not going to. You can't get back on track quickly after that. You can try, but depending on how bad it was, you shouldn't want to necessarily. If you've hurt one of your friends, take care of them. One of the examples I always use with people is I had a game where we went through the checklist. People went through and filled in what they were okay with, what things that they didn't want to see. And it was an Underdark game, and one of the players had never really played before. Huge arachnophobe. doesn't like spiders being talked about, doesn't want to the description of spiders. And they were underground. They're keeping watch. And I started describing the sounds of skittering legs, and I saw utter panic on their face as soon as I started describing it. And so we took a quick break, and I talked with them, and they're like, is this a bad time to mention that I really don't like spiders? I'm like, no, this is a perfect time to mention that you don't like spiders. So we sat down and we talked for a little bit, and it turns out they have no problem with scorpions. And so we reflavored the entire Underdark of that game to scorpion worship instead of spider worship, which, can I just say, a Drider that is half scorpion instead of half spider is the most incredible boss fight ever.
That's horrifying.
It's a horrifying nightmare monster. So if you are a GM who's like, I don't want my creativity limited by safety tools, your creativity is currently limited by your inability to listen to what your players are looking for.
Not to mention, your Underdark sounds cooler. It's like a limited edition, like misprint, and I want to go.
It's Hunter's limited edition Underdark. Yeah.
The best part was watching the face of that player in that boss fight when they realized I made this fight much scarier. But like they had a ton of fun, and everybody remembers that adventure because it was different, and it was fun, and it was intense.
That is such a great story about how like respect and accommodations can make things so much cooler.
Mm-hmm.
And I love that in making the game safer for one player, you made it scarier for everyone else at that table. That is so fun. I love that.
Yeah, it's kind of the perfect example, Hunter. Thank you.
Yeah, it was a fun game. Plus Drider Scorpion is just a terrifying monster.
Oh yeah, that's really upsetting.
Sakura in the chat says, I won't say phobic, but I hate scorpions.
Yeah, I'm not. I am happy that I no longer live in a place that has scorpions everywhere.
Yeah. Sakura says, I would rather have spiders 10 times over.
We have a lot more spiders here. We have big spiders here. We had big scorpions. Well, we also had big spiders in Texas, but they were in your house less.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I used to live in Texas, but it was like far east Texas, where it's basically Louisiana.
Oh yeah, no, that's where my dad's from.
Oh, cool.
I spent a fair amount of time there. Yeah.
Yeah, I was like 45 minutes from like Shreveport, Louisiana. So it's like just over the Texas border. That's awesome. Thank you for going into some safety tool discussions, because those are always useful to have.
Absolutely.
I completely derailed my thought process by talking about scorpions, and I apologize. I have no idea where I was going.
We'll find our way back. I'm glad we deviated.
Okay, let me think here. So the majority of games that Game to Grow works with are kids, though, correct?
Yeah, so we mostly work with adolescents. I think that's our largest population. Jared and I have a lot of experience working with adults as well.
Sure.
A lot of our clinical training with adults. Before we came to Game to Grow, actually, most of our groups were with adults.
Mm-hmm.
I've had the opportunity to run therapeutically applied role-playing game groups with ages 8 to 86. So a very, very big spread, not in the same group, to be clear.
Oh, okay.
But yeah, a lot of the work that we do is with adolescents.
Awesome. Do you have advice for people who are running games for younger players on how to do that effectively?
So much advice. So I will actually plug our training program. So even if you're not a therapist, we actually have a community focused training. It's 4 hours long, coming up on August 27th. And I do want to also remind everyone, we're a nonprofit, which means if you look at the training and you're like, oh man, this would be so cool, and I think I could help people with it, but also I can't afford it right now, we have scholarships. We're a nonprofit. We really, really care about making our trainings financially accessible to humans.
That's awesome.
Don't let that stop you. send us an email. um
Oh, actually,
in
Davy Jones asks a very good question about phobias before we move on to kids.
Mhm.
Um, he says, "What about phobias in game? Are they should they always be avoided, or are they a good way to utilize immersion therapy?"
It really depends. It really depends. And the first is if you are, um, I would say generally, if you're not a therapist
Mm-hmm.
and you're not doing therapy and you don't have explicit consent from your clients,
Right.
even if you are a therapist and you're in therapy, you should not be including phobias in games.
Right.
Depending on an individual's kind of where they are in terms of getting like getting comfortable with that phobia or getting comfortable with being uncomfortable, it may be appropriate to include it in games. So I've had participants who have had phobias around spiders or around other insects. And where they were in treatment, it was absolutely appropriate to include some amount of those in game.
Sure.
But that's something where we have like consent of the group, we have consent of that individual, and we're being really mindful around some of those safety tools in terms of where that person is comfortable, right? And I'm not going to start out with like giant boss battle with a spider.
Mm-hmm.
That's not where we're starting. So it can be appropriate, but there's a bunch of like caveats that have to
Right.
be
And a
first.
lot of that is going to boil down to what is the person you're playing with comfortable with.
Yeah, what are they
Like
comfortable with?
I
And like if I'm not a therapist, I shouldn't be doing intentional
right,
exposure work with
right,
someone. Now that being said, there are things that I, as a person, am not particularly comfortable with that
sure,
I might like to be more comfortable with. So if I think spiders kind of like freak me out, I might say, yeah, spiders kind of freak me out, but I want to play this game. And I just need people to know that spiders kind of freak me out. But honestly, this game might make me feel a little bit more comfortable.
right,
I shouldn't do that though, unless I, as a player, am pretty confident that I'm going to be able to manage my own experience in that game, that I'm going to be
absolutely,
able to say, hey, this is too much, or I'm going to be able to say, hey, I need a break. If every time I see a spider, I have a panic attack, I should not be doing my own kind of self exposure in a
right,
game.
Hmm.
yeah,
But yeah, Elizabeth is speaking to like kind of opting in on your own. Like if I
mm-hmm.
know I have a phobia that I don't appreciate and want to work on, and so I am engaging in my own exposure to that stimulus, like that's fine.
But I still need to have the consent of my group, right? Because
Sure,
my
Oh
group,
yeah, yeah, because this
there's
is not
there's
a
like this
solitary
there's
behavior.
a kind of a gray area in between like what is just like personal self-growth versus what is something that should be handled with a therapist, right? Like
mm-hmm.
there's some stuff like clearly therapist and some stuff like, yeah, read a book on it. And so some of what we're talking about is making sure to be able to identify that gray area. And some of that comes down to, if something that is bigger or scarier than expected happened, am I going to be able to keep myself safe and comfortable? Am I going to be able to like keep myself safe within the game session? So for example, I wouldn't necessarily do that on like a streamed game, and I would want to check in with the rest of my players, because to be totally honest, like when I play games with friends, I don't want to be doing therapy kinds of stuff in
Right,
those
yeah,
games. And so if one of my friends said, hey, I am scared of spiders and like I kind of want to have spiders in this game so I can get more comfortable with spiders, and like I'm not sure how it's going to go, but like I'll tell you if I get uncomfortable, I might say I don't think I can do that this month, right? That's going to
sure,
be I think that sounds great for you, but like that's not a game that I have the bandwidth to play in this month.
mm-hmm.
So it's when we're thinking about any kind of like self growth that has the impact to impact the rest of the people around the table, you don't want to be doing like your own secret therapy
Right,
in a game with other people because they didn't consent to that.
yeah. They didn't ask to be involved in the
Mhm.
in that therapy session.
Yeah. And so just kind of like I don't love spiders, but I also know that in a D&D game, I'm not going to get super dysregulated if there are spiders, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there's levels of that. And so if you're someone who really struggles with regulation and also has a phobia of spiders or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
then maybe that isn't something that's a good fit for a game.
Yeah,
Yeah. And all that said, it Elizabeth started with it depends and gave, I think, a really great explanation for like why you shouldn't.
mm-hmm.
But it depends, and sometimes it's okay, sometimes you should.
Yeah.
And one of my favorite examples was like from a really early group I ran within a PTSD residential treatment facility.
Mm-hmm.
An individual had a phobia of storms, just broadly,
Sure.
from their time in Vietnam, like during like heavy rain periods.
Mm-hmm.
And did they want me to include heavy rain in our game like regularly or even sometimes? Not especially. But they did want to work on that. They were at a place where they wanted some engagement and some exposure, and some exposure that they had agency over. And so what they desired to do was just create a storm cleric and allow them to like play with the concept of storms and kind of take some ownership back of it. And that's where the exposure
what
came
storm
from.
means to them. Yeah.
Right.
That's super
Absolutely.
cool. I like that a lot.
And I think one of the things that Jared touches on in that, right, like, is that was an explicitly therapeutic group. And so the cool thing is that player to some extent gets to have this added layer of safety where they're like, I don't know how good this is going to go. I don't know how well this is going to work, but this is an explicitly therapeutic group, which means if this group gets kind of derailed because we need to spend some more time with regulation, like that might be expected. And also I have this therapist who can help kind of pay attention to how big things are getting and help provide that container, that like sense of safety around that discomfort.
Right.
Which is not something that you should expect or even necessarily trust your friends or a professional GM to be able to do that same thing for you.
Well, and it's also just somebody who isn't trained to do that and doesn't know what they're doing. It's not necessarily going to be helpful to you, and isn't really fair to them to put that expectation onto them.
Yeah, Dr. B talks about this a lot from Take This, in terms of it's really easy to like open boxes, right? It's really easy to ask someone questions about their trauma or their distress and like really pull stuff out in the open. But that is not in itself therapeutic. You have to be able to contain and sort and help make sense of that in a safe space. And that's where a lot of the kind of training comes in. Because you can ask people all sorts of questions and they can tell you their deepest and darkest secrets, and that doesn't necessarily mean they come out on the other side feeling better.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay. Going back to what we were talking about before I got distracted. Kids in gaming, and what advice do you have for people that are trying to run games with kids? I know Davy Jones said earlier in the chat that he is, let's see here, running general after school sessions for kids, just like a after school program. What advice do you have?
Check out Critical Core, and I would check out our training program, are the two big things. But actually, Jared, you have thoughts. Go ahead.
Well, I just like the thought that's like on the tip of my tongue. I'm confident you're gonna voice if I don't interrupt. Is like length of time matters a lot when you are planning sessions for kids. A lot of adults, actually, I don't even know if this is fair anymore. But like, the older I get, the further in my career, the more absurd 6 hours that I can carve out sounds to me.
Yeah.
But that was like my default setting. That's what I expected and wanted from a TTRPG session. And that does not translate well to running games for kids. All of our games are about 90 minutes in length to accommodate like a more focused game, maybe narrower attention spans, always being able to end on a cliffhanger that gets people like excited to come back. Length of time shouldn't be treated the same necessarily when you're prepping games for kids.
Yeah, and giving with kids, I found it extremely useful to have like a window of time for the ending instead of having like a usually with my games I have like this is how long the game is going to be, but having like a larger window of time, so like on a day where the kids are really into it, they know like, okay, we can go all the way to this time if we want to push it and like go, but they also have like a lesser amount of time if they're just not in it today, that they can sort of tap out early if they need to, without feeling like they've abandoned the session or anything like that. Because
Yeah.
I know a lot of kids that have like been in my game because friends of theirs are playing, and they're like, I don't want to ruin it for everybody else, but I'm just not having fun today. And so like having the ability to like tap out early if they need to is super useful to them.
Oh,
I
absolutely.
don't think I've been in a lot of settings in which I had that like flexibility around
Mm-hmm.
timing. Yeah, that's cool.
Yeah, we for that particular game, it's after school for them,
Hmm.
and so it's like after school until dinner, and so all of the kids, we conveyed it to them very early on that like whenever dinner is for them, they can tap out for the day. So some days dinner is earlier, some days dinner is later, and nobody ever asks any questions. It's just that's dinner. They have to run to dinner.
Yeah, so they have
Um,
more autonomy about kind
mhm.
of when they're coming in and when they're leaving.
Yep.
That's really not unlike my game to grow groups. They run from 4:30 to 6, so often right up till dinner. And when we would meet in person, it was like a priority to make sure we had like snacks, like and water available just to keep people fueled and
Hmm.
engaged. Now that a lot of like that particular group is remote, you'll see like between the 5:36 time as like a kid might start to like reasonably wilt at
Hmm.
that time of the day.
Hmm.
A parent comes in and like sets dinner right in front of the game, and they might start eating like in the middle of it. But there is it's fair to be exhausted and burnt out
Yeah.
and not consistently as on and into it every single time, and to be able to acknowledge that and make space for that, and as a group decide like, do we want to scale back our ambitions for this session,
Right.
or is it okay for one particular player to be a little less engaged?
Hmm.
They're fine with it, and so is everybody else.
Hmm.
Like often it comes down to a negotiation, but I like that space is made for
Hmm.
those kind of experiences because they should come up.
Yeah. I've always been a fan of like if whatever you need the game to be for you that day, as long as you're having fun and you're not distracting other people from having their fun, like the game can be what you need it to be. Because I know like I very rarely get a chance to play in games. I'm almost always running games, but when I do get a chance to play, I'm usually very excited at the beginning and then slowly crashing. And so it's always very helpful to me when the people that are running games that I get a chance to play in. One of my buddies has been running a game that both my fiance and I are playing in, and it's very helpful to me that he sees when I start crashing, and he stops throwing important things at me and instead tosses them at somebody else, because he knows that my ability to have bandwidth for it is drained. And then once energy comes back and I'm good to go, he'll transition things back so that I have more choices to make and can be doing other stuff. But if I'm distracted, he knows that like it's not that I'm not enjoying the game. I'm just lower energy right now.
Absolutely. I think that's a great um it's a really great reflection of a GM being really attuned to their players, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
knowing what it is that you need, knowing being able to correctly interpret that you don't not care, you don't want to be there, but you may need a different kind of engagement at that point in time,
Yeah.
which is really important and can be
Yeah.
helpful, obviously, with kids. The other things that I think are helpful with honestly just games with humans, but become especially important with kids are kind of some of that structure and ritual around like how does the game start up? Like how do we get into the game? How do we transition from not game to game? And then how do we transition from game to not game?
Mm-hmm.
Jared mentioned we like to end a lot of our sessions on a cliffhanger,
Yeah.
which works great for our players. But I don't necessarily want to describe like the spider coming down from the ceiling with its like mandibles crashing. Sorry, we're just gonna have a spider theme all day today, with its like mandibles chomping, and then be like, all right, go get in the car with your parents. Hope that ride home goes well for everyone. Like we need to have some kind of,
Right.
I still want them to be excited when they leave, but some kind of regulation space
Mm-hmm.
before we check out.
Some sort of
So
like buffer period.
Yeah, so we have some like ending rituals, and we have a checkout space where people get to reflect on like what someone else did in the group that was really exciting or made their game better, something that they learned or was a challenge for them, and what they're looking forward to next time. And then what they're looking forward to next time is so key,
Mm.
both to get them thinking about next week, but also because my players are always more creative than I am. And sometimes they have really great ideas that I had never considered. And now I have some time to think about how to incorporate their really great ideas,
Yeah.
which means A, my story is better. And B, they get to come back and be like, I was right. I can see the future. And that's fun.
Yeah, I do something similar, but at the beginning of sessions. I always have somebody from the group recap what happened in the previous session.
Recaps, so key.
Yeah,
Especially with kid groups. Absolutely.
So from one point of view, helps me because memory helps me recap everything that happened, but it also, more importantly, shows me what areas they thought were important. So in the recap, if they just don't touch on things that I had put in, and they're like, yeah, that wasn't anything to them, cool, that's fine, let's see what was. They were really obsessed with that one NPC and are pretty sure that he's the big bad and polymorphed himself into a goblin to hide from them. If everybody's on board with that storyline, that might be the new storyline, who knows. But yeah, having an idea of what those players are looking for and what they're excited about is so key to running games. What are you guys? What types of games excite you guys the most? Or do you lean towards like role play and story? Do you lean towards combat and mechanics? What is your play style?
So, ADHD.
Uh-huh.
Um, all of the above. I like games that are a fun mix of both. I think that occasionally getting really crunchy in mechanics, or I love logic puzzles, and sometimes rules are just like a logic puzzle to cause things to explode. I am lucky enough to get to be a player in a fair amount of games that Jared GMs. I have a couple other friends who seem to enthusiastically put up with me, because I will go from not caring about the mechanics to having an idea that maybe I saw somewhere in the player's handbook something that could make this thing that should not work work, if I can just argue, if I can just be a lawyer for a minute and argue my case. And I think that's fun. It creates this like extra level of puzzle. I would not probably want to play in a game that was just all of that all the time, but getting to have that fun space whenever I'm playing in a game. I don't want a game where like players take themselves super seriously. I want it to be fun. I want to get to be impulsive, because I like keep a lock on that for a lot of my life. And so getting to just like set things on fire sometimes feels great. Set things on fire for good, obviously. But, you know, I like to be a little bit of a chaos goblin that also has a lot of greed, I guess, is my answer.
Perfect.
I think, like, when I think about combat and roleplay and exploration, they all matter. I want all of them to be there, but I want to do exploration most of all.
Sure.
I want to like uncover what's up with this environment, and I want to go into a dungeon that does not want me to come out of it, and just poke around and see what is in there that I didn't expect, and feel smart or foolish over and over again. When combat comes up, I get really excited because I've been min-maxing my character and planning for this moment. And also, I hope that this plays out kind of like a level of Into the Breach, which is like a really short, like 5-turn tactical game, instead of like, I don't know, Fire Emblem, and it takes me an hour and a half to get through combat. Yeah, I want combat, and also I want it kind of brief, and I want roleplay, and I kind of want to engage in it with guerrilla warfare, but I want to explore forever.
Right. Like I wanna be able to show off the cool abilities that my character has in combat. But if it has been 25-30 minutes since I've done anything in combat, I am no longer thinking about that combat.
Yes.
That is such an excellent point. I will I have a group of players that are 12 and I have not actually read all of the rule books, believe it or not. Just
There's
at
so
all.
many of them.
I haven't read every page of the Player's Handbook or the Dungeon Master's Guide. I've
Yeah.
like flipped through the Dungeon Master's Guide. I've read most of the Player's Handbook. I play a lot of D&D. I don't
running D&D games is my full-time
Oh.
job. I'm certain I haven't read all of the players.
No, Jared used to be able to be like, oh, I think that's in the Player's Handbook on like page 72. Like he had that level of knowledge. It was incredible. It was really great to get to run. It was very fun. But being able to like just think about, so I have this group of 12-year-olds and they know so much about the rules, which is it is very fun to play with them.
Yeah.
It is really awesome. They do a really nice job of being our rules scholars, but also they have sometimes an unreasonable amount of respect for the GM where they'll be like, well, this is what the rules say, but you get to make the decision. Wow, that's a lot of power. But with those players, a lot of times they want to have like higher and higher level players or higher and higher level characters because they want to get to use all of these rules that are fun. And then when they get a level 15 character, they realize, wow, combat is so boring because I can now do 5 different things on my turn. And so we've done things like, hey, you want to have a level 15 character because you get to do cool stuff, but do you want to limit the number of things that you can do on your turn in combat? Even though the rules say you don't have to, so that we still get to do fun stuff, but combat doesn't take 35 minutes. And so there's ways to adjust those pieces. Because if anybody's one turn takes 5 minutes, I don't want to be there anymore.
Yeah. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how cool your turn was. If I have been sitting there for 5 minutes waiting for it to be done, it doesn't matter what you've accomplished, I'm bored.
Especially a lot of it, even if you're doing a great job role playing, but you still then have to like have a conversation about this is X number of damage and I have to roll this many dice and we have to add and what did this happen? And
and there are definitely groups that want to play a combat simulation the most, and they don't want to play it on like easy mode. They don't want me to adjust the hit points of the boss because like I've been training to beat this vampire lord as written. That's what I want to do. But there are other groups that aren't as interested in that, and a monster only has as much hit points as the combat is interesting. Like I will just pull that punch every time, and it's like the length of a movie's combat, and that's all my players in that particular group want.
Yeah, I've definitely ran combat with the like this monster has 5 rounds of hit points. Somewhere in that 5th round, he's going down. I've definitely done that before, especially with kids, where I'm like, I want to make sure every kid here gets a successful hit off on this guy. And as soon as that last kid has gotten his successful hit off on this guy, that was his last one. Like if you've managed to miss every single time and you get to be the last hit on it and like get the kill on it, the combat is still important to you.
It's better storytelling. I think one of the hardest things about being a GM is figuring out where the line is between following kind of rules or the module or the whatever you kind of created as written, right? Like letting people fail or succeed because the roll of the die, and then deciding when it is actually a better story or a more engaging game to throw those rules out the window. Because some of the best stories, both therapeutic and social, came from the GM just kind of holding to the line of, this is not what anyone wanted to happen, but this is kind of how the rules shake out. And that can be amazing.
Yeah.
And not always. Sometimes it's way more fun to just shift things around a little bit. I'm remembering a game we played, Jared. We had friends come over from out of town. We stayed up really late at night. We had like just ended a fight. And then it went to one of our friends' turn who'd gotten a little distracted. It was very late at night at the time. And they didn't totally realize that combat was over and cast a fireball that burned up like half of everything. And that is a story. This is from like 6 years ago. And this
Yeah.
is a story that like still brings me joy when I think about it.
Mhm.
And Jared, I think you were the GM then. You could have absolutely been like, oh, you were distracted. It's late at night. You didn't realize. And you're like, oh no, that's a bummer.
They declared their intention with so much fervor that like I wasn't going to argue. There's just no NPC to talk to anymore. Like,
It's so good. I love taking like, oh, you weren't paying attention? Okay, well, you did what you did. In our actual play, a few sessions back, the party really wanted a pet chicken. And they convinced they convinced me to put a donation pool up in the chat of like, if we earn this many points, I will give them a chicken. And it was earned
That's so good.
so quickly. But we gave them the chicken because they wanted to be able to make fresh omelets in the morning for their adventuring party. And they're like, it's gonna be awesome. So we give the chicken to the ranger. They become a Beastmaster Ranger or something like that with the chicken as their animal companion. And the very next session, we asked the ranger like, so what did you name your chicken? And they named it Waffles. And we're like, okay, is it a boy chicken or a girl chicken? And they're like, oh, it's a boy chicken. And we're like, okay, cool. And then like a moment passed and they're like, we wanted eggs. It's the whole reason we got this chicken. Why? I was given a 50-50 shot and I chose wrong.
That's incredible and feels like an unintentional commentary on the state of education in this country.
Oh man, it was so fun. And then of course the chat rioted because they had put points towards this so they could have chicken the eggs. Why would we do this? And so then I let them roll for it. I was like 50-50 shot, roll, and we'll like whichever one it lands on, we'll go forward with it. And they did get a girl chicken, so they get eggs now. But they did forget it in a city halfway across the continent. So also just great pet owners.
I feel like pets in D&D are so hard because pets in real life, like,
yeah,
we have a dog named Badger. She's amazing. She will bark at me if I work too long or like come, like I couldn't forget to feed her because she would let me know.
mm-hmm.
But in D&D, it's so easy to just forget about
right
your pet.
Well,
when it's not convenient,
especially if you have players that want to collect like a menagerie of pets.
Yeah,
we have a lot of players who.
Well, every player wants a pet. That's just a rule of tabletop games. If you have the ability to have a pet, it could be a mount, it could be like a familiar, but in some capacity, I know groups that say that they're the goblin they adopted is the party pet. Like it's really whatever, every party will end up with at least one pet in there. But did you guys start with 5th edition or did you play editions before 5th edition?
We started with 5th edition.
Okay.
Yeah, I did some observation of 4th edition, but we started playing with 5th.
Yeah. So I started with AD&D. Because that's what my dad played in high school and college, and he was our first GM. So he was like, the moment we started expressing interest, he was like, "Ooh, let me pull out my old books and I'll teach you how to play." In old school D&D, familiars, if you were a caster who had a familiar and the familiar died, you permanently lost the hit points that had gone into that familiar. So you lost hit points every time you would have to bring in a new familiar. And at some point they just got rid of that because they realized nobody's doing this, and they're just gonna bamf, like they conveniently forget that the familiar is around when they are like swimming down to this cave or like got hit by a cloud kill spell or something like that. And so now familiars just bamf in and out of existence as you see fit, because why not? They're magic pets.
It has been cool to see different aspects of, so I started playing with fifth edition, but as part of doing a lot of research into this and kind of learning about the history, a lot of that is in it's like seeing how games shift over time. I was gonna make a point in terms of like it's so cool to see the way streaming audiences impact games, like the pressures they put on the
Yeah.
GM and the players, and it can make like stream games are so fun. I love playing in streamed games. It's really cool to get to have that like live audience response.
Yeah.
um and it's interesting to see it as well, like how games have shifted over time. That's something we see a lot in video games. Jared and I both play a lot of Destiny 2, and seeing the kind of interplay between the community and Bungie, and like it's this challenging space for any of these games in terms of like, are the loud people on Reddit, do they actually represent the largest part of your player base? Like, how do we respond to people's requests? What do we want to see?
Are they a large number of the player base, or are they a loud member of the
Or are they
player
allowed
base?
loud part of the player base? Yeah, to get to see kind of these games shift over time, both in terms of the mechanics, but also in terms of like expectations for players and like how we handle topics around gender and race and class and other kind of social pieces that come up. Getting to see that shift over time and getting to see more of an acknowledgement of where did some of these games come from, and where did some of the like fantasy lore that a lot of these games are based on,
Sure.
where were the areas and the people that these were coming out of. So getting to see that shift over time has been really cool.
Yeah, I love seeing the interaction between chat and the people who are like streaming. We have the ability that you can spend channel points to buy points of inspiration for characters, and so but they can only ever have 1 point at any given time. And so there was one role, one of our characters, Thrax. He's a Gnoll monk. He was, I forget what he was rolling for. It was like death saves or something. It was real bad. He was like on death's door, and the chat was just spamming anything they could. Every death save he made, they were like, he has to have points of inspiration. Everything he was trying to do. We have something in there that for like an absurd amount of points, you can just buy do something crazy to have me like change the game in some way. People were buying that. Like, people were all over it. They're like, save our boy. And he managed to fail like every roll, even with everything that was being thrown at him. I think they spent like 60,000 channel points or something like that trying to keep him alive. And then he just he couldn't do it. He couldn't roll well enough to make it. And so we ended up, as part of the do something crazy, when everybody else leveled up and he came back with like a level of, I think, barbarian, that he had been like brought back by some like angry spirit that was just like, yeah, you're gonna come back and you're just gonna rage all day, instead of allowing him to pass. And it's much more fun in the story to be willing to change things up and do things a little differently, because like I've played in games where if a character's dead, they're dead. The moment you hit that 0, like there's no chance you're coming back, and like say goodbye to your character. And I've played in other games where we never would get to the point where we haven't even had to make a death save, because they're gonna like hold the character's hand and not let it ever get that far, which is fine as well. But I love the balance of like, oh, you can die and there will always be ramifications to death, but if you want to keep playing that character, we'll keep them going, and it'll just be something new. There'll be something that comes along that you weren't expecting.
There are so many like in canon spells designed to bring somebody back. I think reincarnation's my favorite, just because it's
I love
that
reincarnation.
weird like randomization part. But there's nothing against the narrative of like, okay, fine, we're gonna get that soul back. Who wants to go to the underworld? Like, that's a fun deviation.
Absolutely. BPG Hayward in the chat, I'm pretty sure his character has died like 5 times in my game. He's the healer. He's like a devout follower of the god of healing and stuff like that. And so he is a like hardcore, always up there, always tanking, like doing awesome stuff. That means he constantly gets knocked down. So he has at this point been raised from the dead like 3 times and reincarnated once. So like he's an Aasimar now. Like it's a completely different race than what he started as. It's awesome. And it just makes for fun story that like if you want to keep playing that character, you absolutely can. I'll make an in-game reason for why the character is still around. If you're ready to make a new character, we can do that too. But it's fun.
As a player, if I knew that my game master or my team had reincarnation on tap, I'd be the most reckless person. Like, it's just a way to keep it fresh.
Yeah.
In my mind.
Yeah, it's like I kind of want to play a new character. I don't want a full new character. Let's see, just like this one's a hobbit now. Speaking of characters, do you have a like what is your go-to? Do you have a go-to race class combination? Either of the two?
I have 2 kind of my like longest running characters. So my very first character was a ranger. They had a coyote familiar. They were great. That was a character that it was my very first character and one that I started playing when I was like kind of getting used to D&D. But that idea of like having a companion animal, being good at shooting a bow, and like being decent at nature and survival felt something I was like, I understand this from like all of the fantasy books I've read. This is great. As I got kind of more comfortable with D&D, the character I created a couple years ago that I'll still play with when I can is a Thunder Domain cleric. To be clear, they're not that kind of cleric. So like the way that they will often introduce themselves to a party is they will like hand out a healing potion to each person in the party and be like, I'm not that kind of cleric, so like hopefully these will work for you.
So cleric by like trade.
I'm very good at calling storms
Right.
and creating stabby lightning daggers. Not so good at the whole healing portion, not very touchy-feely. So we talk about in our trainings around like why people play the characters that they play, right? And sometimes your characters, like a lot of times like educators or therapists will play, very calm helping characters. They'll play like that kind of cleric. And sometimes we don't want to have to be responsible in game time.
Yeah.
And so I love that D&D is an opportunity for me to get to like lean into that creative impulsivity that is very much a part of my ADHD. I love that I get to be really direct in my communication through my character, where I don't have to be polite and demure and small and like I get to create storms. And as someone who has constantly my entire life been told to make less noise and take up less space and be a little bit smaller, the idea that I just get to explode with lightning on a regular basis is amazing.
Yeah.
For me, like I don't pay a lot of attention to like which like race I play. It's kind of like just what mood I'm in when I'm making a character. But consistently, I just want to do something that allows me to do things I'm not supposed to. And I don't mean like I'm gonna rob that merchant.
Right.
I mean like it's either like a wizard, because I want the most magic spells possible, and I only want like utility magic. I want that wall to not exist anymore. Or a character with high charisma, or both if I can manage it.
Yeah.
Because I want to be able to talk our way out of anything and like just make barriers disappear. That's really fun for me.
That reminds me of like the there's an old story from the internet somewhere. I don't know where. Probably Reddit. That's where all stories originate. But there was a story of a somebody who played an orc rogue, who didn't put any points into stealth and instead just put points into intimidation. And so they would like walk into a room and a person would see them, and instead of like trying to sneak past, they would just run up and yell in their face like, "You didn't see me!" and keep going. And their intimidation was so high that it worked. I love character builds that just why would you build that character? Because it's fun. My favorite character, I won't say favorite because I've had a lot of characters who would be a misjustice to choose one. One of my favorite characters is a goblin bard who is a child. He was like 4 years old, and just like wandering around. He's just sort of like the earlier when I was saying like a party adopted a goblin, sort of in that same vein of like they found this goblin and he's like,
"Are
It's
you
a little
adventurers? You're adventurers? I want to be an adventurer too. Let's go off and do adventure together."
And just like wanders off and becomes an adventurer. And he's a bard. Like he's not strong, he's not smart, he's not dexterous, but he's very charismatic because he's just this adorable little child. And so people let him get away with whatever he wants to. And that character was so much fun to play. I also have a tendency to write really, really horribly tragic backstories for adorable characters, because I think it's funny. So like that character came from like a tribe of goblins that worshipped a dragon, and like it was this whole thing where the tribe got wiped out and the dragon abandoned them, and like a whole thing, and it was so much fun. He thought he was a dragon. He wore a little dragon onesie with a little hood and tail that came off of it. He's like,
"I'm gonna be a dragon when I get bigger."
he was just adorable. I loved him very much.
That sounds like the best way to manipulate a game master to like kill me, I dare you. Like,
What are you gonna do? Everyone will turn on you if I die.
yeah.
I played him on a stream for a little bit, and it was a Rime of the Frost Maiden stream. I don't know if you've played through Rime of the Frost Maiden, but there's one town where if you do a thing like this one mission for them, when you come back, they're like trying to elect a new mayor for the town. And so in the book it says that they will offer to the party leader to become the mayor of the town, or if the party doesn't have a leader, they will offer it to the character with the highest charisma, which was my 4-year-old goblin child. And so we got back to town from this job, and they were like, we would really love you to run. And in a moment of uncharacteristic self-realization, he said,
"I am a child. And the fact that you're offering this to me is frankly ridiculous."
and then we got kicked out of that town, and it was very, very fun. I love Dungeons and Dragons so much. It's such a good game. Oh man,
I'm speechless just because like I wholly agree and I love that story, so I'm kind of just like soaking that in.
it's so good. So you do both of you run games, or do you both run? Okay. So what is we're getting towards the end here. So what would be the most like absurd moment from one of your games? Like what is something that happened in one of your games where you were just like, I can't believe this is happening right now?
I feel like that happens any time I play a game with children or vets, to be totally honest.
Fair.
Oh man, that is a
Yeah,
hard
it is.
question.
It's just an anxiety-provoking question because like, ask me yesterday, I would have perseverated on it all day. And
Yeah, I recently had a bunch of 12-year-olds make a really good argument about how something in game, I can't remember what it was, like tied back to the like absurdity of NFTs, and I didn't realize these 12-year-olds even knew what NFTs were in a game. We do, this is not a great answer to this question, but it's the one that I'm immediately thinking of. So we recently had campaign. My players wanted to do like a classic detective story.
Sure.
Um, and I realized very quickly that my 12-year-olds did not understand a lot of the tenets and tropes of a classic detective story, which meant like we went into a tavern. We have soup taverns. There's not alcohol in the game because they're 12-year-olds. So we're
Right.
just not doing that. So we have two soup taverns. Everything's the same. It's just soup.
I love that.
Done. Easy. So we go into these soup taverns and they're supposed to be finding information from Charles.
Okay.
Charles is like clearly part of the underground mafia in this space. And they walk in and I do a like really good job of describing that all of this is a tavern full of mercenaries that are clearly more powerful than any of these players. Because I'm like trying to set this up as like, you're supposed to be sneaky. This is like a social challenge. And they walk in and they go, hey, where's Charles? To the whole room. And I'm like, okay, all right. So I have the whole room just like look up at them and then immediately like ignore them. Like no one is looking at them. No one will make eye contact. Like trying to provide this information, like maybe this isn't the direction you're supposed to be heading. No. They go, hey, tell us where Charles is or we'll beat you up. So I'm like, okay, maybe they need a more explicit clue. So I have the like leader of this tavern come over and is like, hey, don't threaten people in my tavern. I will kick you out. Like, I do not think you could take a fight in here. This seems like a bad idea. Like, maybe you should leave or like talk to people quietly. And they're like, no, we need to know where Charles is. You should tell us where Charles is or we'll beat you up. They proceed to get beaten up by the 30 mercenaries in this tavern. So luckily, there happens to be a tavern like 3 doors down that also we know where Charles is. Because in my head, I'm like, all right, we have infinite taverns to make this happen. Eventually, you will learn that you should be quiet. It takes 2 taverns. On the 3rd tavern, they're like, oh, we should be sneaky. So they turn to each other and they're like, how should we be sneaky? Should we talk to people individually? No, that seems, there's like lots of people in this tavern. They're like, I know. We can put something in people's soup that makes them have diarrhea. And then they'll have to go to the bathroom and we can talk to them then. And they look at me and they're like, we have
so
something
that
will make them have diarrhea, right? And in my head, on one hand, I'm like, no, you don't. And the other hand, I'm like, this is Tavern 3, and you finally figured out that you should talk to one person at a time. Yeah, you
of course
absolutely, absolutely know how to make this happen. So they end up poisoning someone's soup. They corner them in the bathroom. And then they're super nice. They're like, hey, are you okay? Can we get you something? Here's some crackers. Also, do you know where Charles is? And it was just this like really incredible space where like as a game master, I was like, I have clues. You're gonna understand this is a social challenge. Nope. Yeah. You got kind of you were like intimidation is the way to go. Right. And that's not so like we got there eventually and I was just like, what is happening?
That's so funny.
These are but we got there. And they got the information about Charles. And the next time we ran into a magical coffee shop and they were like, oh, we should talk to one person.
That's called growth.
I was like, growth. Putting diarrhea, causing stuff. And so, yeah, that's
awesome.
Growth.
I love kid games. There's some of the wildest nonsense that I've ever seen has come out of kid games.
Yeah. It's incredible.
I'm not prepared to top that, but like the story that jumps to my mind for like an absurd L turn I did not expect was there was a vampire plaguing the town that my players were trying to protect, and they were frustrated with these frequent attacks, and they wanted to take it to the source, and they located where the vampire was dwelling, and they found like his hideaway, and they go and they're ready for vampire murder. That's what they wanted. And they surprise him, and he's asleep in his coffin, and they like pry it open, and I'm ready to describe like the scene of uh like we're gonna stake him, and he's probably gonna like wake up in the last moment and get spooked, and I get interrupted by one of the kids just excited to make like an impulsive joke about how he's sleeping with like a nightcap and like a stolen plushie from the town. And immediately the other players and I kind of like melt to that description. And another kid's like, no, we can't hurt him. And ultimately they gave him a name. I'm fond of really lame names for NPCs in my game. So his name is Kevin Bloodlust, and
So good.
they were like, okay, no, we're gonna find a local farmer, like a pig farmer. We're gonna make sure we got a set. We're gonna set him up with blood all the time. He can leave the town alone. And now there's like trade goods between Kevin and the town, and I was gonna help them kill a vampire, but like they were just too excited and impulsive, and you can never tell where games are gonna go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's awesome. I'm a huge fan of like names that just you just sit there and you're like, why? What? That's not a fantasy name. Like, in the most recent episode of our actual play, do you know what a thrycreen is? They're like the mantis people. So I introduced twin thrycreens, whose name are Thor Axe and Abdomenis.
Love it.
And they're just barbarians, and I'm very excited to play my two little just hulked out brain dead boys. They're gonna be great. But let's see here. I've told the story before, but it's been a while, so I'll tell it again. I think the moment in a game that just so thoroughly sent me for a loop of like, I don't know what to do from here, was also involving vampires. There was a vampire like nest, and they were like spawning all this undead and stuff, and they were attacking a town. And the party went off to try and fight them, and they played weekly. So every week we would sit down to play, and every week they would come up with a plan. Between sessions, they would have a plan. They would get there. They would try and execute the plan. The plan would fail, and then they would leave. And so it was literally like 2 months of playing, of them like every week going in, doing something, and then just going, nope, this was a bad idea, and leaving. And every time I'm like, it could work. Just do it. Keep going. Like don't give up on it so easily. Excuse me. So they kept leaving. Eventually they went to like the emperor or somebody, and they were like, there's a vampire nest. We need some sort of like crazy powerful radiant weapon that we can take in there. And so the emperor had his mages get together and made them like basically a radiant nuke, that he was like, carry this into the middle of the den, set it off, get out of there as fast as you can. It should clear them all out. And so they took it, and they're like, awesome, we've got this great thing. It's gonna do exactly what we want it to do. We shouldn't have any other problems. And then on their way back to the town, they stopped in this city that had like a pretty high Thieves Guild presence, and they were trying to get this other thing for a different mission they were doing. And the Thieves Guild was like, well, that's really expensive. And their response was, well, we have this magic nuke. Can we trade that for it? And so they traded this magic nuke to the Thieves Guild in exchange for an item worth substantially less. And then they went back into the vampire cave, and came very close to getting wiped out again. And then had the gall to sit there and complain to me that I had made the nest too difficult, and there was no way for them to defeat it. And I was like, I gave you a nuke that you immediately sold at the first opportunity. Players are absurd, and I love them very dearly. Every game I play has something in it where I'm like, I don't know how you've managed to do this. Oh my goodness.
Love that story.
Let's see here. BBG Hayward said, not my character, but I also was freaked out that we had to destroy an evil weapon by plunging it into the heart of its owner. The worst part was realizing this literally destroyed the man's soul in the process. That sounds familiar. That might have been one of my games. Oh man, thank you guys so much for coming on. I really appreciate it. Do you wanna plug where people can find you?
Yeah, absolutely. So we technically exist on Twitter at Doctors Kilmer. We aren't super active on Twitter, so actually a better place to find out like the things that we are doing is to follow Game to Grow. So Game to Grow. You can also find us at gametogrow.org. We have some really exciting stuff coming up. So if you're going to be at Emerald City Comic Con this week, we have 4 panels. If you were going to be at PAX West, we have 9 panels, 8, 9 panels. We have a couple of workshops and a bunch of panels, which is really exciting. If you are thinking about going to PAX West, but you don't have a ticket yet, we are doing some giveaways through our Twitter at Game to Grow is the Twitter. So check us out there. We have some really exciting projects. We've got Critical Core is launching. If you didn't get into the Kickstarter, physical kits will be available soon, and digital kits are available online. We have that community training coming up a little bit later in August. That will be in 2 weeks. We are running a campaign. We run groups in hospitals as well for hospitalized youth, and we're working on expanding that. So we have a fundraiser going for that as well. We have a lot of projects, is basically what I'm saying. So you should sign up for our newsletter or check us out on Twitter.
Awesome.
Yeah, I have nothing to add. Elizabeth covered it all. We share that at Doctors Kilmer account on Twitter, which is a viable way to reach out to us if you can't remember how else to find us. Like, that will work. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much for coming on. I appreciate you guys swinging through and talking, and I am very excited to see all the awesome stuff that you guys are doing with Game to Grow and all of that stuff. And yeah, thank you for coming
Absolutely.
on.
Thanks for having us on.
Absolutely. For everybody else, we don't have hooligans tonight. Because half of the people that are in the cast are still sick from Gen Con. So we're not going to be doing that tonight. But we will be potentially doing something. Maybe do a video game stream or something like that with the people who aren't currently dying. So we'll be back tonight, maybe. If you're not in the Discord, join the Discord. That's where we'll keep things posted. We'll also be posting it on Twitter if we decide to go live tonight. Thank you everybody for coming out, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Have a good one. Bye.
Bye.